So here we have question 7 in the chapter 3 homework, and we're told that this company has total estimated overhead costs of $195,910. And you'll see I put it here into a big bucket because in the first part of the problem, we're assuming that the company uses a single predetermined overhead rate using direct labor hours in the allocation base. So we're first asked to calculate the POHR. And so I know my top number that was given to me, but I'm not given the total estimated number of direct labor hours. But I figured that out over here. For product C, I know it requires 3 direct labor hours per unit. It tells me that here. And I know I'm making 4,700 units of product. So if I multiply the two numbers, I'll get the estimated number of direct labor hours required to make all these units of product C. Then for product D, that product takes 2.6 direct labor hours per unit. I'm going to make 3,900 units of product D for a total of 10,140 direct labor hours required. So adding the two direct labor hour numbers together down here, I get 24,240 estimated total direct labor hours. So I put that number into the denominator. That's my allocation base. And when I divide, I get my POHR of $8.08, which means I'm going to allocate $8.08 in overhead for every direct labor hour worked. So the next part of the problem asks me to calculate unit product costs for both product C and product D using that single POHR. And this, of course, is the Chapter 2 approach. So before I forget, I'm going to go ahead and add in the direct material costs per unit and the direct labor costs per unit for each of the products. So I have this information here, and these figures were just given to me in the problem. I didn't have to, for the direct labor, I didn't have to multiply an hourly wage rate by the number of direct labor hours per unit. I was simply given the direct labor cost per unit. So I included those amounts here. So this last piece, these two figures represent the overhead cost per unit calculated using the single POHR. And there were two methods I could use to get these overhead costs per unit. The shortcut approach is to take the number of direct labor hours per unit of product, and that's 3 for product C, and multiply that by the POHR. And my answer of $24.24 represents the overhead cost per unit. This method works because the number of direct labor hours of 3, that's already expressed on a per unit basis. And I know I'm allocating $8.08 in overhead for every direct labor hours worked. And so if it takes 3 to make 1 unit of product, I'm going to allocate $24.24 in overhead per unit of product. The other way I could have calculated it is to take the total number of direct labor hours, 14,100, to make all the units of product C, and I had calculated that up here in the first part of the problem. Here's where I calculated the number of direct labor hours to make all those units of product C. So if this is the total number of direct labor hours that I'm going to work on product C, if I multiply that number by the POHR, I'm going to get the total amount of overhead allocated to all those units of product C. Then I can divide by the number of units of product C to get my per unit overhead cost. So either way, it's $24.24. I'm going to add that per unit overhead cost to direct materials and direct labor costs per unit to get my total unit product cost for product C. And I'll use the same approach to get my answer for product D. So now in the next part of the problem, I'm going to switch to activity-based costing. Now what we're doing is we're taking that same total dollar amount of estimated overhead, the $195,910, and we're splitting it into 3 different buckets. So we can see down here, we're putting $13,990 of the overhead into a machine setup cost bucket, another $80,640 into a purchase order cost bucket, and another $101,280 into a general factory cost bucket. And rather than using just one activity measure in the allocation base, I'm choosing a logical activity measure, a different one, for each bucket of overhead costs. So for machine setup cost, I'm going to use the total number of machine setups as my allocation base for this bucket of costs. And I'm given this number up here in my table of data. The 590 is the total number of machine setups. And I'm always going to use the total in my allocation base for each of these mini POHR calculations. So when I divide, I get $23.71 per setup. Down here, I'm continuing my calculations. So we'll continue on in the same way, taking our purchase order costs, dividing by the activity measure that we're using for this bucket, the number of purchase orders, getting our mini POHR, or our activity rate, and finally doing the same thing down here with our general factory cost. And you might recognize this number, the $24,240, represents the total estimated direct labor hours that we had calculated here in the first part of the problem. So once we've calculated these activity rates, we can then use them to apply overhead to our products. And so I'm showing the calculations for product C. We would go through the same steps to allocate overhead to product D. So going back to our expected activity table, we see product C, we think we'll use 290 machine setups, and we're allocating overhead at the rate of $23.71 per setup, which we calculated over here. So multiplying these numbers gives us the dollar amount of setup cost that we're allocating to product C. The rest of the setup costs, so the difference between the $13,990 total setup costs and the amount we're allocating to product C, the rest of it's going to go to product D. Down here, we're multiplying the 1,180 purchase orders, which we see up here in the product C column, by the dollar amount of overhead per purchase order to get the purchase order cost allocated to product C. And down here, finally, we're taking the 14,100 direct labor hours that will be worked on product C and multiplying by this $4.18 figure that we calculated over here. So these are the 3 overhead amounts that we're allocating to product C. Finally, we'll total them up, and here's the total overhead allocated to product C. We have to convert this to a per unit amount because that's what we're asked for in the problem. So we're going to divide by the number of units of product C to get our $21.50 in overhead per unit. Finally, to finish the problem, since the problem asks for unit product cost, we'll add the direct material cost per unit and the direct labor cost per unit. And these figures are exactly the same as they were when we used a single POHR to calculate unit product cost. So these amounts are staying the same. It's just the overhead that's changing. And here's our answer then, $60.10 in unit product cost for product C. So you'll go through the same steps to allocate the overhead to product D, and of course your numbers will all be different, but the process will be the same.